If you move like that on my show tomorrow night, I will personally see to it that you never appear on American television again. Do you understand me?" Ed Sullivan's face was red with fury as he stood backstage at CBS Studio 50, pointing his finger at 21-year-old Mick Jagger. It was October 1964, and the Rolling Stones had just finished their rehearsal for the Ed Sullivan Show. And Ed Sullivan had watched in absolute horror. Mick Jagger hadn't just sung. He'd gyrated, thrust his hips, made gestures that were unmistakably sexual. The rest of the band, Brian Jones, Keith Richards, Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts, had played their instruments. But Mick had performed, and Ed Sullivan, the man who had reluctantly accepted Elvis and carefully controlled the Beatles, decided that the Rolling Stones were a bridge too far. What happened over the next 6 months would create one of the most famous confrontations in television history, and prove that sometimes rebellion wins, even when authority tries everything to crush it. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when rock and roll stopped asking for permission and started taking what it wanted. To understand why Ed Sullivan was so threatened by the Rolling Stones, you need to understand the difference between them and the Beatles. When the Beatles appeared on Ed's show in February 1964, they'd been carefully managed. Brian Epstein had dressed them in matching suits. They'd smiled, been polite, answered questions respectfully. Yes, they'd had long hair and played rock music, but they'd still operated within acceptable boundaries. They were boys you could bring home to mother. The Rolling Stones were different, deliberately, aggressively different. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, had specifically marketed them as the anti-Beatles. Where the Beatles were clean, the Stones were dirty. Where the Beatles were polite, the Stones were rude. Where the Beatles smiled, the Stones sneered. And Mick Jagger was the embodiment of everything dangerous about the Rolling Stones. He wasn't handsome in a conventional way. He was androgynous, with full lips and a thin body that moved with unsettling sexuality. When Mick performed, it wasn't just music, it was provocation. By late 1964, the Rolling Stones had had several hits in England. Not Fade Away, It's All Over Now, Time Is On My Side. They were huge in the UK, but America was different. To really break through in America, you needed Ed Sullivan. The Beatles had proven that. One appearance on Ed's show had made them the biggest band in the world. The Stones needed that same platform, but Ed Sullivan wasn't eager to give it to them. He'd seen footage of Rolling Stones concerts, the chaos, the screaming girls, and most troubling, Mick Jagger's performance style. This wasn't entertainment. This was something else, something sexual, threatening, inappropriate for American families. Ed's booking team convinced him to at least meet with the Rolling Stones. The ratings from the Beatles had been astronomical. If the Stones could deliver even half that audience, it would be worth it. Reluctantly, Ed agreed. The Stones could appear, but there would be strict conditions. The Rolling Stones arrived in New York in October 1964 for their first American tour. They were excited, but also aware of their reputation. They knew Ed Sullivan disapproved of them. Mick Jagger, in particular, knew he was the problem. The day before the show, the Stones came to CBS for rehearsal. Ed Sullivan watched from the control room as they set up on stage. They were going to perform Around and Around, a Chuck Berry cover that was raw and energetic. When the music started, Mick began to move, not the careful, controlled movements the Beatles had used. Mick moved like he moved in clubs, in concerts, in front of audiences that had paid to see exactly this. His hips swiveled, his body undulated. He grabbed the microphone stand and thrust it forward. It was unmistakably, undeniably sexual. In the control room, Ed Sullivan stood up, his face darkening. "Stop the music," Ed commanded. The band stopped playing. Confused, Ed came down from the control room, and walked onto the stage. The atmosphere immediately tensed. The Rolling Stones knew they were in trouble. Ed looked at each of them, then focused on Mick. "What do you think you're doing?" Ed asked, his voice cold. "Performing, sir," Mick replied. "That," Ed said, pointing at Mick, "is not performing. That is obscene. That is vulgar. That is exactly what I will not allow on my show." Brian Jones, who was more diplomatic than Mick, tried to smooth things over. "Mr. Sullivan, we can tone it down. We'll be more careful." Ed turned to Brian. "I don't want you to tone it down. I want it eliminated. Tomorrow night, he will stand still. He will sing. He will not move like a stripper. This is a family show." Mick felt anger rising, but tried to stay calm. "With respect, Mr. Sullivan, this is how I perform. This is what makes our music work. The audience expects this." "I don't care what the audience expects," Ed shot back. "I care about what's appropriate for American television, and what you just did is not appropriate. Now you have a choice. You can perform tomorrow night like professionals, standing still and singing, or you can leave right now and never appear on this show. The decision is yours." The Rolling Stones exchanged glances. This was their chance to break America. But if they compromised, if they let Ed Sullivan dictate how they performed, were they still the Rolling Stones? Keith Richards spoke up. "Mr. Sullivan, we're a rock band. We move when we play. It's not a conscious thing. It's just what happened." "Then you need to learn conscious control," Ed replied. "Because tomorrow night, if I see that kind of movement, I will cut to commercial in the middle of your song, and I will make sure every other television show in America knows you're too vulgar to book." The Stones left the studio shaken. Back at their hotel, they argued about what to do. Brian and Keith thought they should compromise. "This is Ed Sullivan. We need this. We can do one performance his way. Then we can do whatever we want." But Mick was resistant. "If we start censoring ourselves, where does it stop? What's the point of being the Rolling Stones if we're just going to be what old men tell us to be?" Charlie Watts, usually quiet, said something that stuck with all of them. "The Beatles did what Ed asked, and it worked for them. But we're not the Beatles. We're supposed to be different. If we act like the Beatles, what are we?" The question hung in the air. What were the Rolling Stones willing to sacrifice for success? October 25th, 1964. Show day. The Rolling Stones arrived at CBS Studios hours before the taping. Ed Sullivan made a point of meeting with them again before the show. "Gentlemen," Ed said, his tone formal and cold, "I trust we have an understanding. You will perform professionally. You will stand still. You will not embarrass me or my show. Is that clear?" The Stones nodded, but Mick's jaw was tight. He hadn't decided yet what he was going to do. The show began at 8 p.m. Ed did his monologue, introduced other guests. The evening proceeded normally. Then it was time for the Rolling Stones. Ed's introduction was notably brief and cold. The Rolling Stones. That was it. No enthusiasm, no build-up, just a name, said with barely concealed distaste. The Stones walked onto the stage. America got its first real look at them. Long hair, casual clothes, nothing like the Beatles' matching suits. They looked rough, dangerous, different. They launched into Around and Around, and for the first few seconds, Mick did what Ed asked. He stood relatively still, just singing, but the music got into him. The rhythm, the energy, the pure rock and roll of it. And Mick started to move. Just a little at first, a shoulder rolling, then his hips, then his whole body was in motion, exactly the way Ed had forbidden. In the control room, the director looked at Ed, waiting for the signal to cut to commercial, but Ed didn't give it. He stood there, his fists clenched, his face red, watching his worst nightmare unfold on live television. He could cut away, but that would be admitting he couldn't control his own show. So Ed let it happen, seething with rage, but powerless to stop it. The Stones finished their performance. The studio audience, Especially the teenage girls went crazy. The reaction was electric, undeniable. As they went to commercial, Ed walked onto the stage. Mick braced himself for the explosion, but Ed's face was a mask. He said nothing, just stared at Mick for a long moment, then walked away. The message was clear. This wasn't over. The Stones left the studio knowing they'd won the battle, but possibly lost the war, and they were right. The next day, Ed Sullivan's office released a statement. The Rolling Stones' performance was inappropriate and will not be welcomed back to the Ed Sullivan Show. We regret giving them a platform for their vulgar display. The ban was total and public. Ed wanted everyone to know that he would not tolerate being defied. But then, something unexpected happened. The ratings came in. The Rolling Stones episode had done huge numbers, not Beatles numbers, but still massive. More importantly, the Stones had generated enormous publicity. Every newspaper in America was talking about them. The controversy had made them famous. Within weeks, their records were selling better in America. Concert venues were selling out. The ban from Ed Sullivan, intended to punish them, had actually helped them. Meanwhile, the Ed Sullivan Show's ratings began to slip. The youth audience that had tuned in for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones wasn't watching anymore. Ed had positioned himself as the enemy of rock and roll, and young people were turning elsewhere for entertainment. By January 1965, just 3 months after banning the Rolling Stones, Ed Sullivan's producers came to him with bad news. "We're losing market share. We need something to bring back the youth audience. We need the Rolling Stones." Ed was furious. "Absolutely not. They defied me. They embarrassed me. I will not reward that behavior." But the numbers didn't lie. Without the youth audience, the Ed Sullivan Show's dominance was slipping. Competitors were gaining ground. Ed faced a choice: maintain his pride or save his show. In March 1965, Ed Sullivan's office quietly reached out to the Rolling Stones management. Would they consider appearing on the show again? The Stones were surprised. Ed Sullivan wanted them back. After publicly banning them, their manager explained what was really happening. "His ratings are down. He needs you more than you need him. That means we can negotiate." And najus they did. The Stones agreed to return, but with certain guarantees. They would perform 2 songs instead of 1. They would get more airtime. And while they agreed to tone down the most extreme movements, they would not stand completely still. Ed agreed to these terms, though it clearly pained him. He needed the Rolling Stones. The Stones' second appearance was scheduled for May 1965. This time, there was no pretense of warmth. Ed's introduction was perfunctory. "The Rolling Stones are back." The Stones performed, and Mick moved, but slightly less provocatively than before. It was a compromise, not a complete surrender from either side, but the real confrontation came in January. The Rolling Stones had released "Let's Spend the Night Together," a song that was explicitly about sex. Radio stations were debating whether to ban it. The lyrics were too suggestive. Ed Sullivan's office contacted the Stones. "You can perform on the show, but you have to change the lyrics. You cannot say, 'Let's spend the night together' on family television. You have to say, 'Let's spend some time together.'" The Stones were outraged. "Change our lyrics? Censor our art? That's exactly what we won't do." But their management explained the reality. "If you don't do the show, you lose American exposure. If you don't get American exposure, your album won't sell. Is it worth losing millions of dollars over one word?" Mick Jagger was furious, but he was also practical. He agreed to change the lyric, but he had a plan. January 5th, the Rolling Stones appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show to perform "Let's Spend the Night Together." Ed had won. He'd forced them to censor themselves. When the performance began, Mick sang the changed lyric, "Let's spend some time together." But every single time he sang "sometime," he rolled his eyes dramatically. He looked directly at the camera with an expression of exaggerated disgust. He made it absolutely clear that he was being forced to say this, that it was censorship, that he hated every second of it. It was passive-aggressive protest at its finest. Mick technically did what Ed demanded. He sang the censored lyric, but he made sure everyone watching knew it was censorship, knew it was wrong, knew that Ed Sullivan was forcing him to compromise his art. Ed was furious when he saw the performance, but what could he do? Mick had followed the letter of the law while completely violating its spirit. In the control room, Ed Sullivan turned to his producers. "Never again. I never want to see them on this show again." And this time, Ed kept his word. The Rolling Stones never appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show again, but they didn't need to. They'd already won. The confrontation between Ed Sullivan and the Rolling Stones became legendary. It represented the exact moment when rock and roll stopped asking permission from the establishment and started taking power for itself. Ed Sullivan had been the gatekeeper, the authority who decided what was acceptable, but the Rolling Stones proved that the gatekeepers were losing control. The audience didn't care what Ed Sullivan thought was appropriate. They wanted the Rolling Stones exactly as they were. Raw, sexual, rebellious. And if Ed wouldn't give them that, they'd find it somewhere else. The eye-rolling Sometime performance became one of the most famous moments in rock and roll history. It showed that you could technically comply with censorship while making it absolutely clear you didn't respect it. Mick Jagger had found a way to simultaneously bow to authority and mock it. And that moment changed how artists dealt with censorship. You couldn't always refuse outright, but you could comply in ways that made your protest clear. Ed Sullivan died in 1974, still bitter about the Rolling Stones. He never forgave them for defying him, for making him look powerless on his own show. In interviews late in his life, Ed was asked about the Stones. "They represented everything wrong with modern music," Ed said. "No respect for decency, no understanding of what's appropriate for families. I tried to give them standards, and they threw it back in my face." The Rolling Stones, meanwhile, went on to become one of the biggest bands in history, and they always cited their battles with Ed Sullivan as formative moments. "Ed Sullivan tried to control us," Mick said in a 1995 interview. "He thought he had the power to make us behave, to make us conform. But he didn't understand that we drew our power from not conforming. The more he tried to suppress us, the more attractive we became to young people who were tired of being told how to behave." Keith Richards was even more blunt. "Ed Sullivan was the old world trying to control the new world, and he failed. We didn't destroy him intentionally. We just existed in a way he couldn't accept. And that existence was enough to show that his time was over." The story of Ed Sullivan and the Rolling Stones is about power, specifically about what happens when old power structures confront new ones. Ed had all the traditional power. He controlled access to television, to American audiences, to mainstream success. But the Rolling Stones had a different kind of power. They had authenticity. They had connection with a generation that was rejecting everything Ed represented. And ultimately, authenticity beat authority. The lesson isn't simply always rebel or never compromise. The Rolling Stones did compromise. They came back after being banned. They changed lyrics when forced to. They weren't pure idealists who never bent, but they were strategic rebels. They knew when to fight and when to yield. And when they yielded, they did it in ways that preserved their dignity and made their protest clear. That's the real art of dealing with authority that tries to suppress you, not refusing everything all the time, but choosing your battles, making strategic compromises, and finding ways to resist even within compliance. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who appreciates strategic rebellion. Have you ever had to comply with something you disagreed with, but found a way to protest it anyway? Share your story in the comments, and remember, power isn't just about who can force compliance, it's about who people choose to follow. Ed Sullivan could force the Rolling Stones to change a lyric, but he couldn't force audiences to stop loving them. And in the end, that's the power that matters.